In the vast and complicated tapestry of Byzantine history, few stories are as strange, stirring, and ultimately tragic as that of Basil the Copper. He was not born a prince. He wasn't a warrior of noble blood or a senator from the golden halls of Constantinople. He was, as his name suggests, a man of the forge, a coppersmith. His hands knew the weight of metal, not the weight of crowns. Yet somehow, he would rise to challenge emperors. He would drape himself in purple, the forbidden color of imperial power, and he would ignite one of the boldest and most unexpected revolts the Byzantine Empire had ever seen. But his rise, as remarkable as it was, would be matched only by the cruelty of his fall. The world into which Basil was born was not a peaceful one. The Byzantine Empire in the early 900s was a realm of tension, betrayal, and transition. The throne was not always passed down by birthright. It was a prize, fought over with schemes and swords, with whispers in dark corridors and bloody battles outside city gates. The people had long grown used to an instability, to watching one ruler replace another, each promising prosperity and delivering only more taxes, more wars, more pain. And in this atmosphere of uncertainty and disillusionment, Basil the Copper emerged not as a general, but as a symbol, a reflection of the people's anger, their exhaustion, their yearning for change. Nobody knows exactly what first pushed Basil to take action, but by the year 920 he had made his position very clear. He believed that the reigning emperor, Constantine Ducas, was a usurper, a man who had taken the throne by force and held it without legitimacy. To many, it was dangerous nonsense. To others, it was a truth they dared not speak. But Basil not only spoke it, he shouted it, he acted on it, and most daring of all, he wrapped himself in royal purple, the sacred color reserved only for the emperor himself. In the Byzantine world, that alone was enough to mark a man for death. Yet Basil was not afraid, or if he was, he did not show it. His courage, or perhaps his madness, inspired those who had long been silent. Disgruntled soldiers, angry peasants, merchants crushed under imperial taxes, all began to gather around him. They did not care that he was not royal. They cared that he was bold, that he spoke like them, that he stood in the open and dared the empire to silence him. In a world where emperors hid behind palace walls, Basil walked among the people. He declared that he would restore the throne to Michael VI, the former emperor who had been overthrown. He did not do this with quiet petitions or whispered plots. He led open marches, he gave speeches. He built a following that grew faster than anyone in the capital had anticipated. In villages and towns, people began to call him their leader. In Constantinople, his name began to circulate, first in curiosity, then in concern, and finally, in fear. The imperial court was stunned. Who was this man? How had a coppersmith, with no army and no noble blood, stirred such unrest? Spies were sent to investigate, generals were ordered to prepare, but still, Basil's movement grew. It was not his military power that threatened the throne. It was his ability to capture hearts. He spoke in a language the common man understood, not the polished words of diplomacy, but the raw voice of the streets. He talked about justice, about dignity, about an empire that had forgotten its people. And for a brief, brilliant moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, something would change. But power does not let go so easily. In the heart of Constantinople, behind the marble walls of the imperial palace, plans were being made. Emperor Constantine Ducas was no fool. He knew revolts did not need to be large to be dangerous. They only needed momentum, and Basil had it. The empire had faced military threats before. It had fought off Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, but this was different. This was a threat from within, from the very people the empire claimed to protect. At first, the government tried to discredit Basil. Rumors were spread. They said he was insane, a criminal, but the people did not believe it. They had seen him, they had heard his words, and so the empire shifted its strategy. Troops were dispatched, quietly, and then with force. Raids began on towns that had supported him. Suspected lies were arrested. And still, Basil pressed forward. His greatest act of defiance came when he attempted to march into the capital itself, Constantinople, the jewel of the empire. He would not attack it, he would not burn it. He wanted to speak, to stand before the city and let his voice be heard. But by then, the empire had made its decision. Basil would not be allowed to speak. He would not be allowed to gather more strength. He would be stopped no matter the cost. The rebellion had reached its peak, and as Basil approached the gates of the city, it was clear that the moment of truth had arrived. His supporters believed something remarkable might happen, that the people inside the capital would rise up, that soldiers might refuse to fight, that, perhaps, against all odds, the empire would listen. But what happened next would shatter those hopes, not just for Basil, but for all who had dared to believe that justice could come from rebellion. This is where the tides begin to turn. This is where betrayal waits in silence, and this is where the story of Basil the Copper begins its descent. Not into obscurity, but into a fate so cruel, so ruthless, that even centuries later, it still echoes as a warning to those who rise too quickly and fall even harder. The gates of Constantinople stood tall and indifferent. The same gates that had welcomed emperors, armies, and triumphs for centuries now loomed as an immovable barrier against a man who had dared to believe that justice could come from below. Basil the Copper, the man who had never worn armor but had won the trust of the people, now found himself staring at the edge of empire and the beginning of betrayal. His supporters gathered close behind him, their eyes filled with fire, their hearts pounding with hope. But beyond those gates, there was no welcome waiting. Only silence and soldiers. It didn't take long. The imperial army struck with precision, trained and cold. Unlike Basil's followers who were driven by passion and belief, the empire's soldiers were driven by orders. And in a matter of hours, what had felt like the start of a revolution turned into the scene of a massacre. There was no grand battle. There was no glorious final stand. The rebellion was crushed not by the might of war, but by the weight of inevitability. The empire always won. At least, that's what history had taught. And that's what Basil now learned. He was captured, not as a warrior, not even as a political rival, but as a criminal. To the imperial court, he was a dangerous fraud, a man who had dared to wear purple without earning it, who had spoken of justice without being born into power. But to the people, even in defeat, Basil remained something else. He was a voice that had spoken truth when everyone else was afraid. He was a man who had dared to challenge the storm with nothing but conviction. And now, with chains on his hands, he was no longer just a rebel. He was a symbol. What happened next was not a trial. There were no witnesses, no defense. The decision had already been made. Basil had broken the unspoken rule of empires. He had reminded the people that power could be challenged. And for that, the punishment would not be quiet. The emperor did not want him forgotten. He wanted him erased, humiliate him, made into an example so brutal that no man would ever try the same again. In ancient times, execution was not always about ending a life. Sometimes, it was about sending a message, and Basil's fate was written not in law, but in fear. The court needed to make sure that his memory did not become a myth, that his story would not inspire future rebels. And so they planned something cruel, not just to end Basil's life, but to crush his legacy. But what they didn't understand was that cruelty does not always silence a story. Sometimes, it makes it louder. Though historical records are vague about the exact details, what is certain is that Basil the Copper met an end that was merciless. Accounts suggest he was publicly humiliated, paraded before the same people who once cheered him. It is believed he was mutilated, not out of necessity, but out of spectacle. He was executed in a way meant to shame, to mock, to erase his dignity. His body was disposed of without ceremony, a final insult to a man who once dreamed of restoring honor to the throne. But even as the empire did everything to destroy his image, something unexpected happened. The people did not forget. They whispered, they remembered, they passed down stories, not just of his rebellion, but of his courage. They told tales of how a simple coppersmith once wore the imperial purple, not because he was hungry for power, but because he believed in justice. And in that belief, his story refused to die. Historians would later debate the meaning of Basil's revolt. Some would call it foolish, a doomed fantasy of a man who didn't understand the machine he was up against. Others would call it heroic, a rare moment when the voice of the common man shook the walls of power. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Basil the Copper did not change the empire. He did not overthrow the throne or rewrite the laws. But he did something that few others dared to do. He reminded the empire that it was built on the backs of its people. And for a brief moment, those people believed they could stand. What makes Basil's story so haunting is not just the brutality of his end, but the clarity of his purpose. He didn't seek bloodshed. He didn't raise armies to destroy. He raised a voice to question. And in doing so, he paid the price that empires often demand from those who speak too loudly. Yet still, he stands in history not as a king, not as a conqueror, but as a reminder that even in the darkest systems there are always those brave enough to resist. In the centuries that followed, the Byzantine Empire would face many more rebellions, invasions, but none carried quite the same raw humanity as the story of Basil the Copper. His name might not be etched into golden monuments or sung in royal hymns, but in the silent spaces of history, in the memories passed from mother to child, from elder to youth, his story endured. Because sometimes, it is not the victors who define the soul of a nation. Sometimes, it is those who dared to lose. And now, as we look back across more than 1,000 years, we must ask, what kind of courage does it take to rise with nothing? What kind of strength does it take to stand against power with only principle? Basil had no crown, no army, no wealth, just a voice, and the courage to use it. The empire buried his body, but it could never bury his story.